what were the characteristics of Porfirio Diaz's regime? So remember, Porfirio Diaz was a caudillo, right? Remember, caudillos are these dictators. And the reason you have these in Latin American history was, remember, that you had this kind of economic division, right? Remember, there was a few wealthy people who owned most of the land, most of the resources, and many, many poor people who didn't. And when you have that kind of society, you basically has to have a kind of authoritarian government to keep it from falling apart, right? Because the poor people would certainly like to have some wealth, and the rich people, there's not that many of them. Now, Porfirio Diaz governed Mexico for more than 30 years. And under him, there was some economic development. The problem was almost all that economic growth and development went to his buddies, his allies, the people who helped him to stay in power, right? So that's kind of a problem. And so what happened was many Mexicans are like, our country's getting wealthier, but we're not sharing in that wealth. We don't like that. And so his response was to restrict freedom even more. Right? People are questioning the government, questioning why the money is only going to his buddies, and his response is to try and stop that, right? To restrict that kind of challenge. No one asked about questions 2 through 4. These questions focus on the revolution. I apologize. One student did ask last class about the 1917 Constitution. That is the Constitution that had a lot of anti-Catholic kind of statements in it. So for example, Catholics were not allowed to own property beyond just the church building. You couldn't have like Catholic schools. Those were illegal, right? So that was one kind of restriction that this Constitution had. It didn't make Catholicism illegal, but it did put serious restrictions on Catholics, like they couldn't own church property. They couldn't own property beyond the church building itself, so no schools. Now, how did the Industrial Revolutionary Party bring stability and economic development to Mexico? How did it maintain itself in power? What impact did it have? Right. So the person, when you think Mexican or the Industrial Revolutionary Party, think Lázaro Cárdenas. When you think Lázaro Cárdenas, think socialist. Right? He's a non-communist socialist. Remember, communists are kind of socialists, but there were people who were socialists who were not communists. Remember, socialist is someone who believes in communal ownership of property for the benefit of the community, and that can be a local community, it could be a whole country. So one thing that Lázaro Cárdenas and the Industrial Revolutionary Party did was they backed off on the anti-Catholic legislation. It doesn't make sense to discriminate against Catholics when like 99 to 95% of your population are Catholics, right? That's just going to make people angry, not a good idea. So that helps bring some stability. And that allows Lázaro Cárdenas, who becomes president of Mexico in 1934, to engage in land reform. He will force people who have a lot of land to sell their land, and then that land will be distributed to poorer people. Right? Now that's not capitalist. That's against property rights because you're forcing people to sell land. He doesn't care. He's a socialist. He wants to have that land shared out among more people. There will be a dispute over wages between American oil companies in Mexico and Mexican workers. And what's key, what I want to emphasize, American companies controlled Mexican oil. So our country made a lot of money off Mexican oil. And because of this wage dispute, remember Lázaro Cárdenas is a socialist, he tends to favor workers, he will nationalize the American oil companies. What does nationalization mean? It means he forces the American oil companies to sell the oil companies, or to sell their business to the Mexican government. Right? So he's going to force American oil companies, which are privately owned, to sell their businesses to the Mexican government. So the Mexican government, this is a socialist policy, is going to own that oil, and it can then use that revenue stream, right, that wealth, to finance the economy, to develop schools and roads and things like that. And what's interesting about Lázaro Cárdenas is, unlike Porfirio Diaz, he doesn't try and stay in power for 30-some years. He will actually peacefully transition out of power. There's not another Mexican revolution. There's no civil war. With a successor from the same party. This is one-party rule. This isn't true democracy. Right? You'll just have one party that's in charge. So this is kind of socialist. It's not really democratic. The reason this works for Mexico is that this provides stability. Having one political party in charge provides stability. In addition, it also provides flexibility, right? It also provides flexibility because if you have a bad leader, you can move them out, right? Or when it's just time to have a new leader, you can move them out. The limited freedom and the economic development that then exists will bring success and stability to Mexico. So Mexico is going to do quite well under this system. And the example I gave was the per capita GDP will triple, right? It's going to go way up. So moving on then to Turkey, what were the characteristics of the Turkish state that Ataturk established, right? And it should be easy to remember who Ataturk is connected to. He's connected to Turkey. He's got it in its name because Ataturk means father of the Turks. He starts off as a military officer, right? He's a guy that is going to help successfully win a Turkish civil war and defend Turkish territory from people who kind of want to seize it and add it to their own countries. And then he will establish in Turkey a republic patterned off of the West. In fact, he particularly looks to France, which has a secular law code, right? He does not, even though he's a Muslim, and most Turks are Muslim, he does not want to create a religious government. He wants to create a secular government like the ones in Europe. That means he gets rid of Islamic law, Sharia law. He gets rid of it. And instead, like I said, he institutes French-inspired law. He will also get rid of the caliphate. Remember the caliph, the successor of Muhammad, under Mehmet, after the Turks conquered Constantinople, the Turks claim that they're the caliphs. He says, nope, not anymore. And women will even get the right to vote and be elected, right? So this is very much a secular kind of Western-style government. Why did Indians expect more freedom from Britain? How did the British respond to Indians who wanted more freedom? Right? Well, the Indians expected more freedom because they fought in World War I for the British Empire. Right? They fought in World War I for the British Empire, so they expected to be rewarded. However, the British government was afraid that India was going to move for more independence and like actually trying to become an independent country and lead the British Empire. So the British government responded by restricting Indian freedom. So, for example, they increased the censorship of Indian newspapers, which, of course, you have rising Indian expectations, but the British want to restrict freedom. So it's kind of a problem. What was the Chinese government like after the fall of the Qing? And how did the Chinese people react to Western and Japanese imperialism? What side was China on during World War I? And I'll take those questions along with question 16. How did the Versailles Treaty treat China? Cheat China actually is actually correct. How did Chinese people react to such treatment? And then what was the Nationalist Party and the Great Northern Expedition? Why was Chiang Kai-shek not so successful in developing China as Mexico was? So after the Qing government fell, there was chaos in China. There was no effective central government. And I used, you may recall, this image to help us think about that, right? You have this Chinese person here being strangled by imperialism and the warlords. There were these Chinese warlords who dominated China because China had divided into what were essentially multiple different countries. Chinese people said, you know what, we're being beaten up on because we're Chinese. We Chinese people need to unite and work together to build a strong China. That's nationalism. And that's what Chinese people will do. This kind of experience of being beaten up by other people makes the Chinese say, hey, you know, we want to be powerful. To do that, we need to be united. Now, China and Japan will both be on the side of the Allies during World War I. Right? They're both on the side of the Allies. And this creates a problem because remember, there were German-controlled parts of China. There was Chinese territory controlled by the Germans. During World War I, the Japanese will kick the Germans out and take that territory. The Japanese, after the war, say, hey, we're an ally, so we should get to keep this territory. The Chinese say, yeah, but it was originally our territory, so it should be given back to us, and we were also an ally. And in the Versailles Treaty, Japan is allowed to keep this Chinese territory. Now, they're not allowed to keep it forever, but they're allowed to keep it for like 25, 50 years. The Chinese aren't happy about that. And the Chinese naturally feel betrayed. They say, oh, these liberal democracies, you know, they claim to be so civilized and so good, but look, they just gave away our territory without our permission. Right? So the Chinese feel betrayed, right? Who are these people to give away territory that belongs to us? Now, Sun Yat-sen will die in 1925, and leadership of the Nationalist Party will pass to this guy, Chiang Kai-shek. Right, Chiang Kai-shek, and you can see he's dressed as a soldier. He very much was a soldier, even though he'll be basically kind of a military dictator of China. He is the one that will launch what's called the Great Northern Expedition. He's based in the south of China. That's why it's called the Northern Expedition, because he's going to march north. And he is going to lead this Great Northern Expedition and defeat these guys, the warlords, and then unite much of the country under Nationalist Party rule. Right, and that I did this on purpose. This time, nationalist isn't just nationalism. That's the name of the political party. That's why it's capitalized. In many ways, Chiang Kai-shek, I think, is similar to Lazare Cardenas. Right, he acts in a similar way. He's trying to do something very similar to Lazare Cardenas, but he's unsuccessful for a couple reasons. One is that Japan will invade his country while he's trying to develop it. Second, he will be involved in a civil war. Chiang Kai-shek was very much anti-communist. Right? Chiang Kai-shek was anti-communist. He hated communism, and so he wanted to crush the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party wanted to take over. The Chinese Communist Party thought it should be in charge, not the nationalists. So there's going to be a Chinese civil war. So moving on then to the Russians. Why did the revolution of 1917 succeed while the revolution of 1905 failed? What form of government did the revolution initially establish? What role did Vladimir Lenin have in making the communist revolution successful? So the quick explanation of this is simply the loyalty of the army. In 1905, when there was an attempted revolution during the Russo-Japanese War, the Russian army stayed loyal to the government and put down the revolution. But in 1917, when there was a revolution, the army mutinied and supported the revolution. Right? Remember, I tell these stories to help people remember this. Remember, in World War I, Russian soldiers were expected to go into battle without guns. Right? The Russian army was treated badly by their government. Their government failed to supply them like it should have. And so the Russian army was sick of all this by 1917, and they're going to support a revolution against the government. What's established, though, initially is not a communist government. What's established is a republic, a liberal democracy. However, this liberal democracy has a fatal flaw in that it wants to continue the war. But remember, the war is the whole reason why the Russians mutinied and had a revolution to begin with. So this will end up being a mistake. This gives room. Oh, goodness. My apologies. When I go through and prepare this, I try and put the slides, and I missed one. Because the question is, how does this then get to Lenin? There we are. So we had this other part of the question, what role did Vladimir Lenin have in making the communist revolution successful? Remember, communism is not supposed to happen in Russia, right? It's supposed to happen in the industrialized countries first, like Great Britain. That was Marx's prediction. But Vladimir Lenin was a communist. He wanted Russia to become communist. Well, how do you do that? Well, he argued that you could have a successful communist revolution with what's called a vanguard party. Vanguard is a military term. It means the people marching in the front of the army, the people leading the army. So he said the Communist Party can organize workers in the industrialized cities of Russia. Remember, not all of Russia is industrialized. There's not that many workers in Russia. However, there are a lot of workers in individual cities that were very important. Remember, Russia was only semi-industrialized, so there's not a huge number of workers in the country, but there are some workers in important cities. And so Vladimir Lenin will use the party to organize those workers, seize those cities, and launch a successful revolution. And the Communist Party will be so well organized and disciplined that they will then win a subsequent civil war. Okay, we had no questions there.